The window watcher, the house next door to Martin Dunn's, was, by all outward appearances, ordinary. A two-story colonial with white siding, dark green shutters, and a front lawn that always seemed just a little too neatly trimmed. Mrs. Keller, the woman who lived there, was just as unremarkable. She had been living alone for as long as Martin could remember, her husband long gone, leaving her to care for the house and herself. She was the type of woman you'd see every day, but never think about twice. At least, that's what Martin told himself for the first few months. It had started innocently enough just to glance out of his kitchen window. Mrs. Keller would be sitting in her chair, reading a book, or trimming the hedges in her garden, and Martin would take note of the passing moments. Just a harmless curiosity, but over time, his eyes would linger a little longer. And when she went inside, he'd wonder what she was doing behind those drawn curtains. It wasn't until the first time he saw her in the window at night that things took a turn. He had been pacing his living room, trying to work off the frustration of a particularly bad day at the office. It was late, past midnight. He wasn't even thinking about Mrs. Keller when he happened to glance out the window. There she was, standing in the dark, staring straight ahead. The light from the street lamp outside cast a harsh, pale glow on her face, illuminating the tight, unnerving smile she wore. It wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect from a person who was just lost in thought. No, this smile was too deliberate, too knowing. And there was something about her eyes, something unsettling. They were wide, too wide, as if she were watching something just beyond his field of vision. Martin's heart thudded in his chest. His first instinct was to look away, to ignore it. But he couldn't. He kept watching, like a moth drawn to the flame. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, just his imagination running wild. But the longer he stared, the more he felt the weight of her gaze pressing on him, as if she knew he was watching, as if she was waiting for something. The next morning, Martin told himself he'd never look again. He convinced himself it was nothing more than a trick of the light, a figment of his overactive mind. But when he got home from work that night, his eyes were drawn to the window again. And this time, he saw something new. Through the gap in the blinds, he could see her pacing inside her house. Her movements were jerky, mechanical, like she was trying to avoid something, or someone. But there was no one there, just Mrs. Keller, moving in a way that didn't seem natural, her head darting back and forth as if she were listening for something he couldn't hear. It was then that the first seed of doubt was planted. Maybe he was just seeing things, but maybe Mrs. Keller wasn't as ordinary as she seemed. In the days that followed, Martin found himself increasingly drawn to that window, to her house. He'd tell himself that it was curiosity, that he was just passing time, but he couldn't stop himself. It wasn't long before he realized he was watching her more than he was living his own life. He noticed the strange patterns in her behavior, how she would sometimes stand motionless in front of the window, staring out into the dark street, and how, on occasion, she would turn abruptly and disappear into a room without a sound. But what disturbed him most was the fact that the house seemed to swallow up the sound of her movements. He never heard the creak of the floorboards or the rustle of her clothes. It was as if the house was holding its breath. The days blurred together. His own life seemed to fade in comparison. Work, meals, sleep all became secondary. All that mattered was the window. And then, one night, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Mrs. Keller wasn't alone. He hadn't expected it at first. He thought maybe it was a trick of the light again, a shadow moving in the corner of his vision. But then, as the figure stepped into the dim light of the living room, he saw it clearly, a tall, dark shape, hunched and unnatural, standing behind Mrs. Keller. It was so out of place that for a moment, he thought it might be a figment of his mind. But no, it was real. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, towering over Mrs. Keller, its face obscured in the darkness. And then, to Martin's horror, it spoke. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see Mrs. Keller's lips moving in response, and then she turned her head slowly toward the window, as if she could feel his gaze. Martin froze, paralyzed by the weight of the moment. His pulse hammered in his ears. He needed to look away, he had to. But his eyes were glued to the glass, locked in a silent confrontation with something he could never have imagined. In the following days, the strange occurrences began to escalate. Martin noticed that Mrs. Keller's house was no longer the same. The windows were always shut tight, even during the hottest summer days, and the garden that once bloomed with flowers had become a tangle of weeds. She never left the house. He never saw her outside, not once. And then there was the night when he heard a strange sound, a kind of low, guttural growl that echoed through the walls of his own home. He thought it might be coming from Mrs. Keller's house, but when he ran to the window, there was nothing. Just the empty street, silent and still, but the growl lingered in his ears, vibrating through his bones. Days turned into weeks. Martin's obsession with Mrs. Keller and her house grew to the point where he could no longer function. His mind frayed at the edges, the lines between reality and nightmare beginning to blur. He couldn't escape the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, something that involved him in ways he didn't yet understand. One night, he could no longer resist. He had to confront her. He walked across the street, his legs trembling beneath him. The front door of Mrs. Keller's house was slightly ajar, and he hesitated, unsure whether he was doing the right thing. But then, the door creaked open, as if inviting him in. Inside, the house was different. It wasn't just the decay that had set in the peeling wallpaper. The dust that seemed to cover every surface. It was something else, something darker. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was Mrs. Keller. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and the smile that had once been unnerving was now a grotesque rictus, stretched beyond what should have been humanly possible. Behind her, the dark figure stood, unmoving, its eyes locked onto Martin with an intensity that burned like fire. "Welcome," Mrs. Keller whispered, her voice distant, hollow. "I've been waiting for you." The last thing Martin heard before the darkness took him was the faint sound of the growl, and the whisper of something far older than he could comprehend. The window was still there, waiting.
woken up to the sound of creaking floorboards. The kind of sound you tell yourself is just the house settling, just the wind. But when he turned his head toward the doorway, he saw him. A man. Standing at the foot of his bed. The room was dark, but the smiling man was darker, just a silhouette, tall and thin, his outline flickering like a bad TV signal. And his face was wrong. The smile was too wide, stretching from ear to ear like someone had carved it into his skin. His teeth were too many, too sharp. His eyes were empty pits, swallowing the light. Daniel couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Then, the smiling man tilted his head. And he whispered, "Not yet." And just like that, he was gone. The second night. Daniel told himself it was sleep paralysis. A bad dream. A hallucination brought on by stress. But the next night, the smiling man came back. This time, he was closer. Daniel woke up to the same sound, the floorboards groaning under a weight that wasn't his. His breath hitched as he turned his head, dread crawling up his spine. The smiling man stood right beside his bed, inches away. His grin was even wider now, stretched past the limits of human anatomy, his lips splitting at the corners. His head twitched in little, unnatural jerks, as if something else was wearing his skin and didn't quite know how to use it. And those teeth, God, those teeth. Not yet. Then he was gone. The third night. Daniel didn't sleep. He sat up in bed, clutching a flashlight like a lifeline. He didn't know what he'd do if the smiling man came back. Maybe scream. Maybe run. But as the hours crept by, exhaustion gnawed at him. His eyes grew heavy. His grip loosened. And at some point, sleep took him. He woke up to the sound of breathing. Hot, ragged, right next to his ear. His body locked up in terror as something crawled onto his bed. He felt the mattress shift under the weight, the sheets pulling tight. The smell of something rotten, something wrong filled his nose. And then laughter. Low, guttural, bubbling up from a throat that wasn't human. Daniel turned his head, and there he was. The smiling man. Lying beside him. Face to face. His smile was no longer just wide. It was open. Stretched into a black, yawning void of razor-sharp teeth. Daniel tried to scream, but a cold hand clamped over his mouth. Now! And the darkness swallowed him whole. Children of the Hollow. When Billy Harper was 8 years old, he learned two things. First, there were monsters in the world. Second, sometimes they looked just like you and me. The town of Murdoch, Maine, had always been the kind of place where kids left their bikes in the front yard overnight and nobody locked their doors. But that changed in the fall of 1987 when the first child went missing. Her name was Rebecca Wilcox. She was 11 years old, with brown pigtails and a pink backpack covered in stickers of ponies and rainbows. One day, she walked into the woods behind her house and never came back. Then it was Danny Withers, age 9. Then the Thompson twins, Sammy and Joel. By Thanksgiving, 5 children were gone, and Murdoch was a town suffocated by fear. The grown-ups tried to keep it together, tried to act like things were normal. But you could feel it, even if you were just a kid. The way they spoke in hushed voices, the way their eyes darted toward the trees whenever the wind blew. There was something wrong with the Hollow. Billy had always been warned about those woods. His father called them cursed. His mother called them haunted. But kids have a way of ignoring warnings. Curiosity is a cruel thing. He and his best friend, Tom Whitaker, stood at the edge of the Hollow on an early December afternoon. The sky was gray, the trees skeletal, their bare branches reaching upward like twisted fingers. "What if we find them?" Tom whispered. His breath came in white puffs. Billy swallowed. "Then we bring them back." They stepped into the woods. The deeper they went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie, heavy silence, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. And then they saw the footprints. Small, bare, leading deeper into the hollow. Billy and Tom exchanged a look before following the prints. The trail wound through the trees, past fallen logs and gnarled roots, until it led to a clearing where a house stood. No, not a house. A ruin. The wood was blackened, charred, the skeleton of an old cabin barely standing. But what stopped Billy's breath was what stood in front of it. The missing children. Rebecca. Danny. The twins. And more dozens more. They stood in neat rows, their faces pale, their eyes empty. Billy took a step forward, and Rebecca turned her head toward him, ever so slightly. Her lips parted. "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was wrong, thin, papery, like dead leaves scraping against stone. Billy grabbed Tom's arm, heart hammering. "Rebecca?" he whispered. She blinked. Once. Slowly. And then, together, they all smiled. Not a child's smile. Not the kind you see in yearbook photos or birthday parties. This was something stretched too wide, teeth too white. Hungry. Tom whimpered beside him, and then they moved. Not walked. Not ran. Just moved. 1 second they were standing, and the next they were closer. Too close. Billy screamed. He grabbed Tom and turned to run, crashing through the trees, branches whipping at his face. He didn't stop, didn't look back, not even when he heard Tom cry out. He just ran. He burst from the hollow and onto his street, panting, gasping. His mother was outside, calling his name, but Tom never made it out. The disappearances stopped after that. Nobody ever found the missing kids. The town moved on, as towns do, but Billy never did. Because sometimes, late at night, he could hear them. Whispers from the woods. Laughter that wasn't laughter. And when he dreamed, he saw their faces. Smiling.